October 28, 312 AD. Outside Rome, on the northern bank of the Tiber River, a Roman general named Constantine is preparing to do something that military logic would call suicidal. His rival Maxentius holds Rome. Maxentius has the larger army, the stronger position, and the walls of the ancient city at his back. He controls roughly the same territory Constantine does, the western half of a fracturing empire. By every military calculus, Constantine should wait him out, exhaust him, not charge directly into his superior forces at the Milvian Bridge. But Constantine charges, and he wins. Maxentius drowns in the Tiber. His body is pulled from the river, decapitated, and his head paraded through Rome on a pole. Constantine enters the city in triumph. He is now the master of the Western Roman Empire. What happened the night before that battle, what Constantine himself later claimed happened, is one of the most contested stories in the history of the Western world. According to Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, who says he heard it from Constantine personally under oath, the emperor looked up at the afternoon sun and saw a cross of light above it with Greek words inscribed, "On tuto Nika," in this sign, conquer. That night, in a dream, Christ appeared and told him to use the sign against his enemies. Another eyewitness account from Lactantius describes a simpler version. A dream, a command to mark his soldiers' shields with the chi rho, the first two letters of Christ in Greek. The two accounts do not perfectly align. Historians have debated their reliability for 1700 years, and hovering behind all of it is the question that still divides scholars, skeptics, and faithful believers today. Did Constantine genuinely become a Christian? And if he did, or even if he didn't, what exactly did his embrace of Christianity do to the faith? Because here is the claim you have probably encountered, stated with supreme confidence in documentaries, podcasts, internet arguments, and at least one enormously successful novel. Constantine corrupted Christianity. He co-opted a grassroots countercultural politically subversive movement. He fused it with imperial power, stripped it of its radical edge, injected pagan elements into its theology, invented the Bible at Nicaea, and produced something that had only a surface resemblance to what Jesus of Nazareth actually taught. Everything that went wrong with the church for the next 1700 years, the violence, the political entanglement, the corruption, it all starts with this one man. That argument is dramatic. It is emotionally satisfying. It gives a clear villain and a clean origin story for every problem Christianity ever had. It is also, in its strongest form, badly wrong. But untangling exactly where it goes wrong and where it goes right requires standing inside the actual history. Not the mythology and not the defense either, but the complicated, morally ambiguous, theologically significant record of what actually happened. Start with Constantine himself, because almost everything depends on whether you can take his faith seriously at all. The case for cynicism is not trivial. Constantine was not baptized until he lay dying in 337 AD, 25 years after his supposed conversion at the Milvian Bridge. He retained the title Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Roman paganism, throughout his reign. His coins bore the image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, well into the 320s. He had his eldest son Crispus executed in 326, on charges almost certainly fabricated by his wife Fausta, and then had Fausta herself killed when the accusations were revealed to be false. He fought brutal civil wars, deployed ruthless political violence, and presided over an empire that ran on coercion. These facts make a certain reading almost irresistible. Constantine was a pragmatist who recognized that Christianity was growing, that it offered a sophisticated organizational network across the empire, and that he could use it to unify a fractured political world. His conversion was, in this view, performance. But the case is more complicated than that. Several details cut against the purely cynical reading. Christianity in 312 was not a politically safe bet. Estimates put Christians at roughly 10 to 15% of the Roman population at the time, a significant minority, but still a minority. The army, whose loyalty an emperor genuinely needed, was largely pagan. Aligning with Christians offered no obvious short-term military advantage. The historian Peter Heather, in his recent work Christendom, argues that Constantine had likely held Christian sympathies for most of his life, shaped by his mother Helena's faith and his father Constantius's unusually mild treatment of Christians during the persecutions, but waited to declare them openly until his political position was secure. The Sol Invictus coins are real, but their interpretation is contested. Scholar Charles O'Dall, after 31 years of research retracing Constantine's life, argues that after 312 Constantine never personally worshipped Sol or any pagan deity, that the Senate added solar imagery to the Arch of Constantine without his explicit direction, and that by 319, Images of Sol disappear from his personal coinage entirely. By 324, after his final victory over the Eastern Emperor Licinius, pagan imagery vanishes from the imperial coinage altogether, and the deathbed baptism, which looks suspicious to modern eyes, was actually a common practice among early Christians. The theology of the time held that baptism washed away all sin, and for a man obligated to take morally compromised actions as emperor, many Christians thought it made rational sense to delay. Constantine had apparently planned to be baptized in the Jordan River, as Christ himself had been, but fell ill and died before he could travel to the Holy Land. None of this definitively proves sincere faith. What it does prove is that the pure cynicism reading requires you to ignore considerable evidence to the contrary. The truth is probably more uncomfortable than either conclusion. Constantine was a deeply flawed man, operating in an entirely new territory no one had mapped before. What it even meant to be both a Christian and an emperor. And whatever his faith looked like privately, his public patronage of the church would transform it permanently. So what did actually change? This is where the criticism of Constantine lands with genuine weight, and where Christians who wave it all away do themselves no favors. Before 312, being a Christian required something, not always martyrdom. The popular image of constant arena executions overstates the severity of pre-Constantinian persecution, which was often sporadic and regional. But it required a fundamental rejection of the Roman social world. Christians could not participate in imperial ceremonies without offering incense to the emperor's genius. They were excluded from most public office. They worshipped in private homes, later in larger meeting places. Church membership was, at minimum, socially costly. The church that emerged from that context had a very particular character. John Howard Yoder, the 20th century Mennonite theologian, whose critique of Constantine has been enormously influential, put it sharply. Before Constantine, it took exceptional courage to be a Christian. After Constantine, it took exceptional courage not to be counted as one. That is not merely rhetorical. When being a Christian became the path to political advancement, when Constantine filled the imperial court with Christians, exempted clergy from taxes, donated the Lateran estate in Rome to the bishop as a permanent episcopal residence, and began building massive basilicas, the character of the church's membership inevitably changed. People flooded in who had no deep theological conviction. The cost-benefit analysis of conversion inverted overnight, and the church, built for a world where faith meant suffering, suddenly had to operate in a world where faith meant power. Bishop Hosius of Cordoba, one of Constantine's own religious advisors, began using the language of Christian empire without apparent discomfort. Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine's court chronicler, constructed what scholars call a theology of the Christian emperor. The idea that Constantine was something like God's appointed vicegerent on earth, almost the earthly embodiment of divine order. A mind like Augustine's, writing a century later, would look at exactly this kind of thinking and see catastrophe in it. But in the euphoria of 313, few asked the questions that needed asking. The consequences were structural. Constantine appointed bishops. He convened councils. He exiled those whose theology he found inconvenient. He used the church's machinery to enforce political unity. By the end of the 4th century, bishops were wielding judicial authority as well as spiritual authority. The wars of the empire began to be framed as holy wars. The church's hierarchy started to look uncomfortably like the imperial hierarchy it had once refused to participate in. A Christian writing in 200 AD would have found much of this unrecognizable. Now let's confront the myths directly, because part of what has happened in popular culture is that legitimate criticisms of Constantine have been wrapped around complete historical fictions. The most pervasive, Constantine invented the Bible at the Council of Nicaea in 325. He gathered the bishops, suppressed the Gospels that showed a too-human Jesus, promoted the ones that made him divine, and produced the New Testament we have today. This is not a disputed interpretation. It is not a minority scholarly view. It is simply false, and the falseness is verifiable. We have the actual records of what the Council of Nicaea discussed. No contemporary eyewitness, not Eusebius, not Athanasius of Alexandria, not anyone who attended, mentions a single word about the canon of Scripture being on the agenda. The council was called to resolve the Arian controversy, to decide when to celebrate Easter, and to address church discipline. Those were its documented purposes, its documented outputs. The myth of Nicaea deciding the Bible can be traced to a 9th century Greek manuscript called the Synodicon Vetus, written more than 500 years after the council, which describes an apocryphal story of books piled on a communion table and the false ones falling off. No serious scholar takes it as historical. The myth gained its modern cultural traction primarily through Voltaire's satire in the 18th century. and then reached a mass audience through Dan Brown's 2003 novel, The Da Vinci Code. The actual canon of the New Testament was not formally settled at Nicaea or by Constantine. Athanasius of Alexandria listed all 27 books of the modern New Testament in his Easter letter of 367, 30 years after Constantine's death. The regional councils that ratified similar lists, Hippo in 393, Carthage in 397, took place 60 years after Constantine died. The Catholic canon was not formally defined until the Council of Trent in 1546. The second major myth, Nicaea invented the divinity of Christ by a relatively close vote, suppressing the original human Jesus tradition. This is also simply false. The vote at Nicaea on the Nicene Creed was overwhelming, roughly 300 bishops to 2, with perhaps a handful of abstentions. Arianism, the position that Christ was a created being, exalted but not co-eternal with the Father, was the minority view, not the tradition being crushed. Christians had been affirming the divinity of Jesus since the 1st century. Paul's letter to the Philippians, probably written in the 50s AD, uses language that the early church understood as ascribing full divine status to Christ. The Gospel of John opens with the declaration that the Word was God. The council at Nicaea was the occasion for precise theological articulation of what the church had been confessing for 300 years, using the Greek word homoousios, meaning of the same substance, to exclude the Arian reading once and for all. What is genuinely true about Nicaea is more interesting than either the myth or the denial. Constantine called the council himself on his own initiative, for reasons that mixed genuine theological concern with political anxiety about unity. He had no vote, but he almost certainly participated in the discussions. He had already tilted toward the anti-Arian position before the council opened. His advisor Hosius had presided over an anti-Arian synod in Antioch months earlier. When the council concluded, he enforced its decisions with imperial authority, exiling Arius and those who refused to sign the creed. Political power shaped the outcome. That is not a myth. But the outcome itself, the Nicene Creed's affirmation that the Son is of one substance with the Father, was not Constantine's invention. It was the majority position of the global Episcopal Church. The word that matters here is Greek, homoousios, same substance. The bishop who championed it most fiercely was Athanasius of Alexandria, around 296 to 373 AD. A young deacon who attended Nicaea and would spend the rest of his life defending its conclusions against repeated imperial attempts to overturn them. After Nicaea, Constantine's religious policy shifted. He became conciliatory toward the Arians, recalled Arius from exile, and eventually turned against Athanasius, exiling him 5 times. The emperor, who had apparently backed the Nicene position, turned against its greatest defender. If Constantine invented Nicene orthodoxy to serve his own purposes, he did a remarkably poor job of defending it once it became inconvenient. The phrase attached to Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, captures what happened in the decades after Nicaea. The Arian controversy did not end at the council. It raged for 50 more years. Several of Constantine's successors promoted Arianism actively. The Nicene position survived not because the emperor defended it, but because bishops like Athanasius refused to abandon it regardless of what the emperor wanted. The phrase you should notice here is, regardless of what the emperor wanted. Constantine's reach into the church was real. It was also limited in ways the critics of Constantine sometimes forget. So here is where I want to take a position, because the subject demands 1. The corruption of Constantine narrative, in its strongest form, is intellectually lazy. It takes a genuine set of historical concerns, the entanglement of church and state, the transformation of Christianity from a countercultural community to an established imperial religion, the influx of nominal believers, the weaponization of theological disputes for political purposes, and inflates them into a conspiracy theory that requires fabricating evidence and misreading councils. But the defenders of Constantine are sometimes equally lazy in the other direction. Pointing out that Nicaea did not invent the Bible does not resolve the question of what the church lost when it traded the catacombs for the palace. The historian's task is not to defend Constantine or condemn him. It is to take seriously both what he preserved and what he damaged. What he preserved, or at least enabled, is not small. The Edict of Milan in 313 ended 300 years of intermittent persecution. It created conditions in which Christian theology could develop openly, in which bishops from across the known world could travel to councils, in which the Nicene Creed could be produced and transmitted. The faith that survived, battered but coherent, to become the largest religion in human history, carried with it a theological tradition forged partly in the furnace of Constantinian controversy. Without Constantine's patronage, it is entirely possible that Arianism would have prevailed. A Christianity in which Christ was a created being, exalted but not divine, is not the same faith. What he damaged is also not small. The church that emerged from Constantine's reign bore the marks of imperial coercion in ways it has never fully shed. When bishops started using state power to enforce orthodoxy against heretics, the Donatists, the Arians, eventually the Priscillianists, they were following a logic that the pre-Constantinian church had explicitly rejected. The martyrs had died rather than compromise with state power. Their successors, a generation later, were asking the state to execute their theological enemies. Augustine of Hippo, writing his City of God after 410, after Rome was sacked and the Constantinian synthesis was visibly cracking, tried to articulate a theology that could survive what had happened. Two cities, he wrote, the city of God and the city of man, not equivalent to the church and state, more fundamental than that. Two loves, two loyalties, two orientations of the will. They are mixed together in history, intertwined, impossible to separate until the final judgment. No earthly city, no Christian emperor, no institutional church is equivalent to the city of God. The city of God is a pilgrim people, passing through history, not at home in any empire. That theology, which Augustine wrote partly in response to the Constantinian experiment's visible failures, is arguably the most important Christian political theology in history. Luther took it. Calvin engaged it. It shaped how the Reformation thought about church and state. It is still being debated, which means Constantine's legacy is stranger than either his critics or his defenders want to admit. The problems he created forced the development of the theological resources to address them. The corruption he enabled produced the minds that named the corruption and thought past it. Here is the question that actually matters, sitting underneath all of this history. What do you do when the power of the world offers to help the kingdom of God? That is not a 4th century question. It arrives in every generation. Every time a political party claims the mantle of Christian civilization. Every time a church is offered tax exemption in exchange for political compliance. Every time an empire invites the faith to become its chaplain. The pre-Constantinian church had a clear answer, enforced by necessity. The faith was inherently countercultural. You could not participate in imperial religion and call yourself a Christian. The cost of entry kept the membership honest. The post-Constantinian church has had to find a different answer, and it has never fully succeeded. That is not because Constantine corrupted a pure faith. It is because the tension was always there, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be avoided. Jesus said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." The first 3 centuries of Christianity survived by keeping the two categories radically separate. The question Constantine posed, without fully understanding he was posing it, was, what happens when Caesar decides to be a Christian? The answer is not simple. It has never been simple. The church has gotten it wrong repeatedly, confusing the cross with the sword, the kingdom of God with the kingdoms of this world, the authority of the Bishop of Rome with the authority of Christ. But it has also gotten it right, in ways that are easy to miss. Every time a bishop stood up to an emperor, from Ambrose confronting Theodosius in 390 to Athanasius patiently enduring his 5th exile, the church demonstrated that the emperor did not own it. Every time a theologian refused the easy synthesis, refused to equate the triumph of Christianity with the triumph of Rome, the tradition kept open the possibility of a different way. That is the more accurate account. Not a pure faith corrupted by a cynical emperor, not a great emperor maligned by ungrateful critics, a messy, contested, genuinely consequential moment in which the most politically powerless institution in the ancient world suddenly found itself inside the most powerful, and had to discover painfully over centuries who it was when power was no longer the thing it was defined against. The church is still working on that answer. And so are you, probably, living as you do in whatever moment history has handed you, navigating your own version of the question Constantine posed. When the world offers to make things easier for what you believe, what do you take and what do you refuse? That question was not invented in 312 AD, but it has never quite gone away since.